I'm terribly sorry. I must interrupt the honourable member. It being 6:49, the House will now deal with the consideration of private members' business according to the order on today's order paper.
Business consideration and second reading of Bill C-300, the Corporate Accountability of Mining, Oil and Gas Corporations in Developing Countries Act, standing in the name of Mr. McKay, Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. McKay, Scarborough-Guildwood, seconded by Mr. Savage, moves that Bill C-300, an act respecting corporate accountability for the activities of mining, oil and gas in developing countries, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development debate. The Honourable Member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a matter of some considerable pride for me to introduce this bill into the House and hopefully to precipitate a fulsome debate and ultimately move it on to the committee. Madam Speaker, we're all proud Canadians. Everyone in this chamber is a proud Canadian. People in the gallery, they're proud Canadians. People watching on television, they're proud Canadians. We're proud of our hockey team. In fact, in Salt Lake City, when the men and the women won gold, I think there's an enormous matter of pride for our nation. In fact, Madam Speaker, students, when they're traveling in Europe, are so proud of their country that they sew a flag on their backpacks for a couple of reasons. One, to say that they're proud Canadians, and two, to say that they're not Americans. So, Madam Speaker, we're so proud at times that we're at pains to tell others that we're not like those Americans. And even, Madam Speaker, sometimes we're right. Certainly we have a superior banking system, we have a superior healthcare system, we don't have a subprime crisis. But frankly, Madam Speaker, there are times that we are morally arrogant to the point of being insufferable. Our superiority is at times unbecoming a nation of dignity. Last week I was visited by some folks from Ecuador, and they talked about a Canadian mining company that was behaving in a way that was distinctly un-Canadian, certainly at variance with our sense of self, our sense of our nation, and our sense of how we operate in this world. The video they presented showed the ugly Canadian corporation trying to gain a commercial advantage over Indigenous people, a company willing to engage in violence to get its way, a company that was using its superior financial resources to get its own way, a company that was quite prepared to abuse the environment in order to get its own way, a company willing to abuse human rights in order to get its own way. To be fair, Madam Speaker, the video did not show the company's side of the story, and basic rules of procedure and fairness require that we at least listen to the other side. Nevertheless, this was a pretty damning indictment of a Canadian company using its financial clout to develop a copper mine. I wish I could say, Madam Speaker, that this was merely an isolated example. Unfortunately, I cannot. There are documented abuses of Canadian companies operating in Guyana and in the Philippines, and possibly as many as 30 other countries, which are acting in manners that are unbecoming of our sense of self as a nation, our sense of how we operate in this world, and our sense of how Canadian corporations should operate in the world. The Toronto Stock Exchange is the most active mining exchange in the world. More money is raised there than anywhere else in the world for mining and exploration. 60% of the world's mining and exploration companies are listed in Canada. It's not my intention, Madam Speaker, to overstate the case by painting all Canadian extractive companies with the same brush. Many, many companies are quite responsible and actively pursue their responsibilities both for the environment and for human rights. They are seriously engaged in environmental compliance and respect for human rights. But, Madam Speaker, we all have reputations at risk by the behavior of certain companies. Not only is there a risk, a behavioral risk, to an individual company, but it is also a national reputational risk. When a Canadian company behaves badly, our national reputation suffers. All of the hard work done by many, many Canadians through NGOs and indeed through the government gets swept aside when our own companies and our own people abuse human rights standards and environmental standards. Our reputation for responsible environmental stewardship gets swept aside when we degrade and we debase other countries' environments. So, Madam Speaker, what to do? Ideally, Madam Speaker, the government should be presenting this bill. Or if not this bill, certainly a beefed-up version of this bill. The National Roundtables on Corporate Social Responsibility and the Canadian Extractive Industry in Developing Countries presented a report on March 29, 2007. Those roundtables, Madam Speaker, were actually sponsored by the government. Yet here we are almost 2 years later, and we have yet to hear the government's response to their report. In fact, Madam Speaker, the roundtables redeposited their report just in the hope, the faint hope possibly, of trying to solicit a response from the government. To date, there's been silence. And Madam Speaker, these roundtables engaged everyone. They engaged government stakeholders, they engaged NGOs, they engaged corporations. In fact, Madam Speaker, it kind of reads like a who's who of the mining industry. Mr. Tony Andrews from the Prospectors and Development Association was part of the round table. Jim Cooney from the Government Affairs for Placer Dome was in on it. VP for Exploration Dennis Jones from Imagold Corporation. Various other, Talisman was represented, various other corporations were represented at this round table, in addition to various NGOs and in addition to, if I may say so, the usual suspects, Madam Speaker. So this was a series of round tables engaged in by all of the stakeholders. They presented a comprehensive report, and yet we have no response from this government.